Hi friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and this is the first video in a series that I referenced a few weeks ago where I'll be connecting the meanings of the numbered pip cards of a Tarot of Marseille style tarot deck, or any pip style deck really, with the numbers of the corresponding major arcana cards. This video is focused on the aces and their relation, if any, to the number 1 major arcana, the card we now reference as the Magician. This video series will probably be of greatest interest to those individuals who are learning or studying the TDM card system. And by TDM, I'm referencing both the Tarot of Milan or Northern Italy, as well as the Tarot of Marseille, which came out of France. When learning the meanings of the pip cards in particular, since pip-style cards are decorative but not illustrative, a natural inclination might be to associate the meanings of the numbered pip cards to their correspondingly numbered major arcana cards. But it's important to bear in mind that in the earliest decks of Tarot, the major arcana cards did not consistently follow the same sequential order from deck to deck. There were many differences between what we now consider a standard tarot deck and its origins, and that's a video for another day. But very clearly, the practice, study, understanding, and evolution, and even the name of tarot has changed over the centuries and through the eyes of the individuals using them, which brings me to my next point, which is the information that I'm presenting in these videos is from my own experience and understanding and not the gospel truth. It's my own conjecture through the lens of my own observations, just like anybody else's is. For the purpose of this video, I'm primarily referencing 6 decks from left to right, which are more or less in chronological order. The Visconti Sforza Tarot deck, which is one of the oldest known decks to exist, and it is of Italian origin. I think this Scarabeo deck is based on the Pierpont Morgan. I'll also be referencing 2 cards from the Carey Yale Visconti deck, followed by a Noblet deck, or Noblet deck, excuse me, which is one of the oldest Tarot of Marseille decks coming out of France. Followed by the Vieville, which was a close contemporary of the Noblet, and actually it's kind of a hybrid between Italian and French influences, and for that reason I think it's very interesting. The next is the Dodal from the early 1700s. This particular deck was recreated by Flornoy, followed by Oswald, which is a deck created, which this deck is based on the deck that was created by the man of the same name and one of the occultists of the last century or the end of the century before it. And finally, the Waite Tarot deck, this particular version being a German publication of A.G. Müller. Now, going back to when I started learning tarot, my first deck of tarot was more or less a TDM style deck. But unfortunately, when I got it home, I had no idea what to do with it. There was a little white book, of course, but I wanted and needed, more information. The first book that I actually was able to find on tarot was the Eden Gray book, which described the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and not the one I had, so it wasn't very useful. I did eventually find this book, which matched my deck exactly. However, I found out that the definitions inside this book more or less mimicked what the Eden Gray book said, so it still didn't make any sense to me because it just wasn't jibing with the cards, and it wasn't enough to go on. And so this is when I began to look at the major arcana as a reference to try to understand the numbered pip cards. And in the years since, I've read repeated examples of how the numbered pip cards reflect and echo the meaning of its correspondingly numbered major arcana card. But I'm going to present some information to you that might rock your world a little bit. Now, it's obviously not as critical when trying to assign understanding to the meaning of the number 1. I mean, we can probably all agree that ones traditionally represent the beginning of something, or at least a lower level of reference of something. We all know we'd rather have $10 than $1 and 10 cookies rather than 1 cookie. But for shits and giggles, let's just look to the card we now refer to as the Magician for our inspiration for understanding the meaning of the number 1. And I have those 6 magicians right here. Let's check out the first major arcana card of the decks at hand. Each deck is consistent in representing a fellow sitting or standing by a table. You see that? Upon which is arranged an assortment of items. In the Carrie Yale Visconti deck, the items are clearly displayed here as sword, chalice, baton, and coin. In the Visconti deck, the Visconti Sforza deck recreated by Lo Scarabeo, we see a knife, what appears to be a generic cup, some sort of stick or wand in the fellow's hand, and also two small discs, and maybe a sphere or a small ball. I'm going to digress on a small tidbit of information that might interest some of you. In reading early accounts of card laws and legal references in the 1500s, there is a reference to the suit of bread, or a suit that references either a loaf of bread or a slice of bread. So it's not hard to imagine how small discs of bread on a table might have been misinterpreted as a suit of coins or discs, or even if the bread was drawn as a cylindrical loaf, how it might be misinterpreted as a suit of clubs. And I think you'll see that when I start showing the aces. I don't know if this is how the suit of coins or clubs came about by card makers who misinterpreted what the image was, or if the deck utilizing bread as a suit just disappeared for other reasons, but it does illustrate how easy it is to misunderstand or for a person to interpret something their own way depending on how they see it. All but one of these decks has the man wearing a floppy hat. Some decks show an assortment of objects that might include dice, small spheres, and further suggest some type of showman, like a traveling con man who comes to town, dares his audience to trust their own eyes to gamble on which cup a small ball that he switched around was housing a small ball. No matter how astute the audience members were, the traveling con man undoubtedly employed a sleight of hand which all but guaranteed that the gambling audience would never guess which cup the ball was under. And in these earliest decks, what we reference as the magician was really a con man, a trickster, and not a magician in the sense that we understand him today. In fact, he wasn't referred to as the magician until much later. In these earliest decks, he is usually referenced as a bagatto or bagatello in the early Italian decks, and as a bateleur in the French decks, which roughly means stage magician or sleight of hand trickster. Some decks referenced him as a mountebank. In every case, in these earlier decks, he's more of a charlatan or a swindler than a magus. The best reference we might give him is as a stage magician, but with all those connotations. In other words, using those definitions to connect the trickster to the number one and how we may apply it to help identify what the aces of the deck means doesn't jive. It becomes problematic because there appears to be no organic correspondence between a card meaning trickster, street hustler, and the aces of each suit. It wasn't until occultists like Oswald elevated his stature to that of the magic one. A magus with obvious references to the magi of the East, whose stature was more of a wise priestly man with magic powers rather than a charlatan. Clearly elevated from the status of street hustler. This new status was necessary in order to make the number one, the first card, fit logically with the meaning of the number one. From one comes all, like a speck of existence before the Big Bang. From nothing or almost nothing, everything is manifest. The occultists essentially manipulated the magician in order to satisfy their agenda of creating a mysterious background myth for the tarot that made it align and have a connection to the number one. This was the birth of Kabbalistic and alchemical and other occult associations with tarot. Until this time, women, and they were more than likely women who told fortunes in clandestine conditions during the Middle Ages, since participating in fortune-telling during the time of the likes of the Borgias and Machiavelli would have been a very treacherous pastime indeed, and one that would get you killed. If these participants who read tarot during those times, the cards undoubtedly interpret it without occult associations that the French occultists eventually subscribed to them. As modern day tarot readers know, one can read tarot completely without occult references. Anyway, the visual transition of the cards after Worth bears this out. In the earliest cards, the items on the table are a bit vague, but they eventually and very clearly can be identified as the suits of the deck, representing the 4 elements that are associated with the deck of tarot: swords, cups, batons, and coins of some variation of them. The best example of occult and esoteric influence can be seen in the floppy hat that was stylistically exaggerated through the centuries, until eventually, by the time of the Worth deck, it all but resembled a man wearing a lemniscate as a hat, and by the arrival of the Waite Coleman Smith deck, the hat was completely replaced by a lemniscate, the symbol of infinity, without end, eternity. From this one comes the potential for all. The common street hustler now came to possess genuine magic powers, and this is the much accepted name and meaning of the number 1 arcana today. But in reading the TDM style cards, he retains his origins as a street hustler and as a trickster, an adept sleight of hand hustler. But when he pops up in a spread of TDM cards, it is a suggestion that one must remain alert. Now, this is where I think stuff gets most interesting. Let's switch gears, and instead of looking to the first card of the major arcana to find insight into the meanings of the cards, let's see how the aces influence the meanings and evolution of the first card of the major arcana. Let's specifically look at the aces from the Visconti Sforza Tarot deck. And more specifically, let's zero in on what we now refer to as the 8 of Cups. The image on the Cariel Visconti deck does appear to have the same type of image as this one, but this one is a lot easier to see, so we're going to use this one. We can see that this symbol is actually a fountain and not a cup. This is interesting because this deck is not just a Visconti deck, it's a Visconti Sforza deck, which commemorated the wedding between 2 noble families. And one of the heraldic symbols for the Sforza family was a fountain. So the choice of a fountain to represent the Ace of Cups is actually really a font. A fountain is a means of tapping into the water source for the community. Water might be thought of as our source of life. We probably evolved as water beings. We came out of the ocean, in other words. What we can all intellectually understand that the number 1 is a low number, the beginning number, which when we count, we start with 1. But assigning the number 1 to take on the meaning as a source of all there is, did that concept single-handedly originate with this very early depiction of a fountain on this particular deck of cards. If we look at the other aces of cups from the other decks, some resemble a castle, but it's more than likely a cathedral, which eventually seemed to morph into a chalice, which retains the religious overtones of the time. So I'm going to show you that. So all of these, after the Visconti Sforza, evolved from a fountain to more of a building, like a church, which then morphed into a very elaborate chalice, which clearly has religious overtones, particularly when we get to the Ace of Cups of the Waite Smith deck. From these particular cards, it's easy to see how chalices or cups became associated with the clergy and spiritual matters and religious individuals, of the community, which eventually evolved to include emotions and matters close to the heart. It's worth noting that the cups in the Visconti pip cards do resemble chalices or cups more than they resemble fountains. But it is interesting that for the ace of this particular suit, they chose a fountain. If the Ace of Cups, courtesy of the Visconti Sforza deck, is what gave rise to the concept of the number one, not only referencing the beginning of something, but as the source of something, from one comes all things, then might it not be that the occultists, while assigning meaning to the major arcana, base their meaning for the magus maybe on the Ace of Cups, and specifically to the fountain depicted on the Visconti Sforza decks? I've never read any reference to this idea anywhere, and maybe it's a bit cray-cray and out there, so I have to reinforce that this idea and connection is strictly out of my own head and not one that I've read in any books on the history of tarot. But if my observation is correct, then the adjustments made to the meanings of cards of the major arcana appear to have, at least in part, been based on the pip cards themselves and not the other way around. This might almost sound like sacrilege. It may not be the case in every numeric instance, but this video series will show other examples of how this idea appears to be the case. In other words, rather than the pip cards getting their meaning from the major arcana cards, I think there are some instances, like I just mentioned, where the major arcana cards' meaning was influenced by the meaning or the imagery from the minor arcana. The remaining aces of the Visconti Sforza Tarot deck, and give me a second to get them together for you. Now, in the remaining aces of the Visconti Sforza deck, we only see individual items representing the suits. There are no hands holding any of the items in this particular deck. Now, I want to reference the Solabusca because the Solabusca is more or less a contemporary of the Visconti Sforza deck. And although we don't directly, see a single hand coming from the side, well, here we have, someone handling or holding the sword here. We have Putti sitting on top of the chalice. We have two cherubs like holding the club, and we have one cherub holding the coin with others in attendance. So although the Solabusca does not directly show any of the aces coming in from the side with a hand, it does suggest that it does suggest a hand, being present in the aces. We do see hands presenting the swords and the batons of later Italian decks, but these decks came from probably the mid-1800s, and so I can't really say with certainty whether or not the idea or the examples of human hands holding the aces came out of Italy or after France. But by the time we get to the earliest tarot decks of France, sorry about the jolt there. I realized I didn't have all my aces displayed, so I went back and did that. But at any rate, by the time we get to the earliest known decks out of Marseille, France, we begin to notice a hand coming from either side, holding the suits, which eventually became known to be the dominant, more aggressive suits due to their phallic reference, whereas the passive or feminine suits stand alone. I don't know for sure where this convention originated from, but we do see that by the 1600s, a hand presents both the sword and the baton, and at least the French decks. I don't have any other examples of early Italian tarocchi decks from the 15th, 17th centuries other than the ones that I showed you, nor can I readily find this information online. So I can't decisively confirm whether the stylistic convention of a hand appearing on those particular aces began in Italy or France. So I will look into that further. There is much significance about the left and right hands. Right hands being ruled by the conscious intellect and the left from the unconscious. But I doubt if those thoughts went into the design of the playing cards since they appear in a variety of ways. Maybe they were copied one way, and due to the printing process, they were printed the opposite way. For example, in the Noblet, the hand holding the sword is a right hand coming from the left. And here it's a left hand coming from the right. So, did one artist copy the other, and then when, the way it was drawn, and then when it was printed, it just reversed the image? I don't know. And you see that consistently, really. And then here we have what appears to be the left hand holding the sword. This is the Dodal, the left hand holding the sword. This is kind of strangely drawn, because the sword should be, for the thumb to be presented the way it is here, the sword needs to be, coming here, right? So this is kind of a strange way to have drawn the hand holding the sword. In the Oswald Worth, it's the right hand coming from the left for the swords, and the right hand coming from the right for the batons, as it is here for the Dodal. So there is like some inconsistency. They're not consistently the same, the way the hand comes. So I don't know, and bear in mind too that, these cards, even as early as the Tarot of Marseille, they were playing cards. They were not used for fortune telling. Granted, I do think, and I'm convinced that, it went on in the salons of, individuals for pastimes and stuff like that. But as far as truly taking on an esoteric or occult identity, I don't think anybody paid attention to how the hands were, appearing in these decks until, probably the end of the 1800s or the beginning of the 1900s. Anyway, getting back to the Ace of Chalices, if the Ace of Chalices or Cups is the ace that came to signify the well or source of what a suit represented, did the other aces follow suit? Excuse the pun. I think we know that the answer is yes. The other aces likewise suggest not only a beginning in a new opportunity or a new start or a trend of something new, but they also represent the influx, an abundance, and a source of something arriving, and not just the beginning of something. In other words, not only do aces suggest the beginning of something, but the potential for its abundance. This concept is reinforced when we consider that 10 is often reduced to 1, furthering the concept that out of 1 is many, and that 10 suggests that a threshold has been reached and a new phase or cycle is due to begin. So out of 1 is many, just like the idea that the occultists apply to the street vendor to elevate his status and to have him coincide, his meaning coincide with what ones really do represent. At any rate, the next video in this series will focus on the deuces and their corresponding card of the major arcana, the priestess or high priestess, and sometimes she was known as Juno. To request a reading or to read my blogs, please visit my website, tarotclarity.com. And to follow me on social media, I'm at The Tarot Reader on Instagram and at Tarot Clarity on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.